Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our vendor showcase. My name is Jeff Hatzel. I'm a Senior Application Specialist at Blue Marble Geographics. For those of you not familiar with Blue Marble, we are a GIS and geodetic software company. We provide a variety of cutting-edge yet accessible products designed for both novice users and experienced geospatial professionals. Our expertise spans the geospatial technology sector, with a particular focus on coordinate conversion, lidar and photogrammetric point cloud processing, and geospatial software development with a user-driven focus. Blue Marble's products include Geographic Calculator, the industry standard for precise spatial data conversion, and advanced coordinate system management. Global Mapper, which we'll talk about today, is an all-in-one GIS application with a comprehensive array of data processing and analysis tools. The Global Mapper LiDAR module is a suite of powerful tools for editing and processing LiDAR and photogrammetric point clouds directly within Global Mapper. Global Mapper Mobile, available on iOS and Android, is a powerful tool for field data collection, viewing, and manipulation. For our vendor showcase today, my colleague David McKittrick will be providing us with a high-level overview of Global Mapper, starting with an introduction to the app's layout and moving on to highlighting some of the more advanced analytical tools as time permits. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Hello everyone, my name is David McKittrick, Outreach and Training Manager at Blue Marble Geographics, and I'm going to spend the next half hour introducing you to some of the basic functions of Global Mapper. We're going to begin with kind of a quick navigation of the layout, the interface. We're then going to go into look at some very specific tools, maybe even looking at some of the more advanced analysis capabilities as well. Just for those of you who are new to the software, I'm going to give you a quick starting point to get familiar with the essential elements so that you can use it more effectively. And why don't we begin with looking at the interface itself? You're looking at the software right now, obviously. You can see even if you have never seen Global Mapper before, it's fairly intuitive how we get started. We've got a button right here in the introductory screen for opening your data files, or we can connect to some online sources. We'll take a look at that in just a little bit. You can go right to configuration to apply some of your settings. Maybe you want to change the default units of measure, things like that. We even have a default data set that you can load. This is a world map if you want to load that onto the screen. And we also have a link to our training to see what training opportunities are available. So this is kind of a good way to get started with the software. Very simple, very intuitive. Continuing our tour, if you look towards the top of the screen, we have an array of buttons. Now for many new users, this can be quite intimidating. How am I ever going to understand Global Mapper when there's this array of functions? Well, you don't have to learn everything at once. And as you'll see when we go through some of our scenarios today, we're going to be looking at some of these functions, looking at some of these buttons and using them for some workflows. Obviously, we can learn in baby steps. You don't have to understand everything immediately, but these buttons provide convenient access to some of the more commonly used functions. Right above our buttons are our menus. Standard layout here. We've got menus for some of the more advanced tools. As you get into working, for instance, with some of the analysis functions, you'll see a lot of these tools available under the analysis menu. And the final stop on our quick whistle-stop tour is what I define as the nerve center of Global Mapper. This is our control center. As you'll see in just a second when we load up some data, this is where all the layers are managed. This is where the display of your data is controlled. This is where the visibility of layers are controlled. Some of the settings pertaining to the layers are controlled. So this is where it begins and ends, right here in the control center. And you'll see that in just a second when we load up some data. So to get started, I'm just going to take a pre-existing file with some layers. I'm just going to drag this from off screen. And as you can see, drag and drop works to load data as well. This workspace contains a couple of layers. We have got some roads, you may see these lines, and we've got some imagery of looks like a neighborhood here. And now we have some data. We have, you can see the layers here in the control center. You can see little checkboxes indicating that certain layers are displayed. I can check these on, check these off, either the vector roads or maybe my imagery. You can isolate what it is you want to work on. So we have control over the display. We can also access options for particular layers. For instance, for my shape file, if I simply double click, it will let me do things like assign labels, define the style of these features, etc., etc. So a lot of different functions can be applied with the options dialog box pertaining to that selected layer. A couple other things to note here as we kind of introduce the idea of navigation around the screen. There is a zoom function, as you can see where my cursor is, quite simple, quite intuitive. But if you're using a mouse, that's probably the easiest way to zoom. I'm just going to scroll my mouse wheel And you'll see when I do that, the map zooms in. Just scrolling the mouse wheel in, scrolling it out again allows me to zoom. Very simple. Also, if I click and hold my mouse wheel, I can pick the map up and drag it. So if you have a mouse when you're using Global Mapper, navigating around is very simple. Zooming in, zooming out, and allowing you to pan as well. Now, as you can see, our default layout is a single map display with all of these, or both of these layers displayed. If I want to create a display layout where I isolate individual layers and look at them side by side, I have that option as well. Right here in my toolbar, there's a button for adding an additional 2D map view. Now it says 2D specifically because their 3D map display is controlled a different way. We'll get to that one just a little bit later. So what I want to do here is I'm going to add a second map view, which by default, as you'll see, is a floating window. And I can dock that. I'm actually going to dock it here on the right side of my screen. So we're going to see two side-by-side map views, which are completely independent of each other by default. So I can control one in terms of the extent, in terms of the zoom level. The other one is independent. It will stay where it was. I have the option to link the two together, both in terms of the center point and the scale. There are two settings that can be applied. Now if I refresh one of these map views, the other will follow. So now they're literally identical. They are the same extent and the same data content, obviously. What I'm going to do to make this a little more meaningful is to specify what layers appear on one side and the other. And that option is selected right here under the Select Layers section. I'm going to choose my primary map first of all. And in this side, which is the left side, I just want to isolate the imagery. So I want to turn off the other two elements, which is one is my roads, the other is the layout layers, which is things like my scale bar, etc. So just imagery on the left-hand side, click OK. And you can see my roads have disappeared. And I'll do the opposite for the second map view. Turn off the imagery, but leave the roads and leave the layout elements. Again, click OK. And now we have two side-by-side views. As I move in one, the other will follow me. It means I can work with my vector data, and I can see the corresponding imagery, but the map is not cluttered. I can isolate just the vectors or just the rasters as needed. Now, the final thing I want to show you by way of introduction is another very nice tool that allows you to kind of get a perspective of where you're working in the context of all of the data you've loaded, and that's our overview map. Again, right here on the toolbar, where my cursor is located right along the top here, we have a button for enabling the overview map. And when I click this, inevitably it's off screen. I'm just going to drag it into view. You can see a little red box indicating the extent of the view that we're looking at right now. Again, this is dockable. You'll notice as I drag it around, it's prompting me to dock it either within the context of this window or within the context of the entire screen. Now, I'm actually going to move it over here to the left. I want to dock it right below the control center. And now you can see very clearly where I am in the context of the extent of this little town that we're working on. You can also navigate using the overview map just simply by clicking on a different location, and your maps will follow suit. Once they update, you'll see the little boxes will follow suit and give us an indication where we are now. And they refresh, as you can see. We're, again, different part of town. One of the buttons that you may have noticed in our intro screen was to add online data. And that's also available in the toolbar here. We've got a globe button that provides access to streaming services. And there's a number of these pre-configured in the software. You can see when I click on that button, terrain data is selected for me. We also have things like imagery data, topographic maps, geological maps, etc. You can even add your own sources, web map services, web feature services, whatever you need. Just to show how this works, this is a streaming service, and I'm hoping this will cooperate. I'm hoping my internet connection will allow me to do this, but I'm going to select just an example of some terrain data and load it into the context of my current map view. We simply click connect. It's going to go out to the server, hopefully, and you can see it actually has populated my overview map already. It's now giving me a different layer. I now have a terrain layer. This is streamed. This is not stored on my local machine. It's streamed from a remote location. If I wanted to preserve this for a project I'm working on, perhaps, I can export this terrain data, this elevation data, to a local file, and then I have it locally. Obviously, I'm not depending on this streaming service. So online data gives you access to a vast quantity, a vast array of data sets from remote locations. One of the most important tools in Global Mapper is the digitizer. The digitizer, if you describe it in a very generic way, is the tool for either creating or editing vector features. And it's initiated from the toolbar using this pencil tool. If I select this tool, move my cursor onto the map view, you'll see it says edit. In its edit mode, it allows me to select an object, and in its selected state, I can perform some edits. I can reshape a feature, I can delete it, I can move it, I can rotate it, I can scale it. There's all sorts of options. In fact, we could take the entire session and just go through various options with the digitizer. I'm not going to. But suffice to say, whatever you need to do with your vector features, you can do using this tool. Selecting, it's difficult to see, but this road that I've selected is highlighted in red. Once selected, as you can see, there's an array of buttons now that I now have access to, again, for moving, reshaping, etc. I can also show the shape points or vertices for these lines or for polygons or for whatever my layer contains, which gives me the ability not only to, at a high level, change the structure of the feature itself, but to manipulate individual vertices, maybe adding a vertex or deleting a vertex or repositioning a vertex. So again, by enabling the display of the vertices, I have complete control over those visual characteristics. Most of the tools for editing, most of the common tools are in the toolbar, but there's also tools that are accessible when you right-click. And as you can see, this is a fairly advanced component of Global Mapper when you look at all of the array of functions here. For instance, under advanced feature creation options, we can create buffers. We can create points spaced along my line, for instance. Just as an example of a couple of things that we can now do based on the fact that this feature has been selected. So that's the default state of the digitizer. In its edit mode, it allows you to change the structure or characteristics of a selected feature or more than one feature. I'm going to turn off my vertices or shape points. The other thing that we can do with the digitizer, obviously, is create features. And there's an array of buttons where my cursor is located right now that allow us to create points, lines, polygons of various kinds. With my line tool selected, I can draw a line, and you'll see snapping is available by default. It wants to snap to an existing line. I'm just simply going to click a few times, and you can see it's as simple as that. I'm not going to complete the line. Obviously, if I did, I would be prompted to put it in a layer, to assign it to a particular layer within my control center, or create a new layer. But that's the digitizer being used to create objects rather than in its edit mode. Obviously, for points, for polygons, it works the same way. Now, you may not anticipate using the digitizer a lot. Maybe your expectation is you're working a lot with terrain data, or you're working maybe with imagery. Well, even within the context of those data types, very often you will need the digitizer to perform certain operations. For instance, you want to crop some data. You'll need a polygon to do that. Or perhaps you're working with point cloud data. It's a vector form. You'll need the digitizer to interact with your point cloud data as well. So it's a very important tool, regardless of how you anticipate using the software. The other aspect of vector data which is important is the attributes. We have options for displaying attributes either at an individual feature level. I've got an info button that you can see, a feature info tool in my toolbar, and select a road, and it will display for me all of the inherent attributes for that road. We also have an attribute editor, which also gives you the display of the attributes in a tabular form. So for that selected layer, for that roads layer, I right click, and you can see edit attributes as an option here. Once again, this is a floating window. It can be moved around. It can be moved to an external monitor, or a second monitor, I should say, if you need, or it can be docked. And I'll just go ahead and dock it right below. And as I said, this gives you a scrollable, sortable, tabular view of all of the attributes for all of these features on my map. And as I select one or more, you'll see they're highlighted right above. So I have complete control over the display. I also can interact with the main map view. These are editable as well. So any of these values can be changed. Just simply select one, select again, and I can change any of these characteristics right here. So it is, as its name implies, an editor. But it does so much more as well. I can search for data here. I have a query builder. I'm going to build a quick query on my roads here, where we're going to look at surface type. The surface type can be either paved or gravel, if memory serves. So I'm going to choose that attribute, and I'm going to make it the operator is going to be equal. I'll just see what values are present, and as I expect, we've got gravel and paved. I'm going to choose gravel for this example, and I'll run my search. And this tabular view now has been condensed to include just the results of my query. I'm just going to move this out of the way slightly, and I'm going to select all of the results. And you can see now on the map display the visual representation of all of the roads that are gravel roads in this case. So that's a simple example of a query. Obviously, queries can be much more complex, but this query builder is linked into the attribute editor. I'll go ahead and close that dialog box, and I'm going to revert back to looking at the entire array of data. And we'll use my digitizer to deselect. A couple of other things that are available here in the attribute editor, a little more powerful tools. We have tools for calculating attributes and for joining attributes. Joining may be something you do if you've got an external file that you want to bring in and relate to a feature on the map. Calculation allows you to perform a function or an operation to calculate new attributes based on existing attributes. So those are a couple of additional tools that are available here in the attribute editor. One other interesting workflow that we can follow with attributes when working with attributes is to adjust the visual characteristics, the display characteristics of the features in a layer to reflect one of those attributes. And here we have an example of a polygon layer which contains a single attribute called zone. This is a zoning map, land use zones, I guess. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a colorized map that reflects those values, a thematic map. This is an option that's controlled within the layer options for that layer. Double click to open up my options, go to area styles, and apply the styling based on an attribute. And we have only one attribute here, zone, so we'll go ahead and select it. And ordinarily, if I was doing this in the real world, I would load the values that are present in that attribute and assign colors accordingly. You can do that manually. I've done this already. I'm going to load a pre-configured file that includes my colors. And you can see it's just nicely configured here with the colors assigned to the individual polygons. We click OK, and you'll see the visual representation. I've already had a legend appear on my map, and now that's been populated with the colors representing these individual land use zones. And this is an example of a thematic map. So once again, we're going to shift focus a little bit here, and we're going to move away from just looking at raster data, and we're going to move into the 3D realm. We're going to look at some terrain data. To begin this process, we're going to introduce a file. We're going to turn on a point cloud file. This is some lidar data. Now, we're not going to go into any depth as far as editing or processing lidar. That would be the lidar module component, and we'll talk about that in a future session. But for now, we simply have this point cloud loaded. It's already been filtered. These are just ground points. Those of you who are familiar with lidar will be familiar with this idea of point classifications. But this is a raw material that lets us create a surface, a terrain surface. Maybe sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a digital elevation model. And Global Mapper provides a very efficient tool for performing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my toolbar. I'm going to select my gridding tool to create an elevation grid. It's essentially a raster layer, a raster model, if you like, derived from these points that you're seeing on my screen. Simply select that tool, define the parameters of your elevation model. I'm just going to use a triangulation mode, which is basically a way for converting 3D points into a raster surface. I'm going to leave all the other settings as they are. We'll click OK. And when it completes, shouldn't take too long, we will have a new layer in our control center, a new raster layer. And we'll take a look at that. We can isolate that in just a second. So turning off my points, the original points, you can now see an elevation surface. This is essentially derived from those points that we previewed. And this gives me an opportunity to introduce some of the 3D components in Global Mapper. Things like the shader. The shader, denoted by the legend on the left side, shows you how the terrain is displayed and shows you, in this case, it's my elevation. But there's various other ways of looking at the terrain. We can look at it as a slope. Now we're looking at not heights or heights above sea level or elevations, but we're looking at angles of slopes here. Very interesting perspective of the terrain. So there are a number of different options for changing the display characteristics of an elevation layer. This also gives us the opportunity to introduce our 3D viewer. Right now, or up to this point, I should say, we have just looked at a top-down view. But one of the major components of Global Mapper is this 3D viewer. I'm just going to bring this up to full screen so we can take a look at it. And we can zoom in, we can pan around, we can increase the exaggeration a little bit if we want to make these mountains a little taller than they are. They're actually not mountains, they're just little hills. But you can get the idea as to the lay of the land now from a more realistic perspective. We'll go ahead and bring this down in size once again, and we'll go ahead and close it for now. So again, those are just some of the principal areas of the software we're working with 3D data. For a slightly different perspective, we can actually look at a cross-sectional view of the terrain as well. And we have a profiling tool. right here in the toolbar, which simply allows you to draw a line. It's a multi-segment line or a single line, depending on what you want to do. And once you complete that, it shows you a cross-sectional view. Once again, it can be docked. So now we can see right above, we can see the line, and we can see what the terrain looks like as we transition along that line. We also have tools in here for doing things like line of sight analysis, so you can determine if there's any obstructions along this path. Maybe you're using it for broadcast applications and you want to know if your signal will have any obstructions. You can do that type of analysis. So this profile tool gives you multiple sub-tools for working with your 3D data. As you can see, I can zoom into a particular area. If I want to focus on just these little two mountains or little two rises here, I can obviously focus on those as well. So that's the profile tool. A slight variation on the profile function is what we refer to as perpendicular profiling. Now I'm going to give you a quick illustration of this, but before I do, let me right click and go to the settings, because we want to enable our perpendicular profile, that's a tongue twister, perpendicular profiling function. This is essentially a series of profiles defined by a path going either side of that path. Now I'm going to bump my perpendicular path length up from 50 meters to, let's make them about 500 meters, a little bit longer. And we can also define how many perpendicular profiles there are. Right now it's set to 30 along the full extent of the path I create. That'll do fine for our example. We'll click OK, and OK once again. And this time you can see, rather than having a single profile, we have a series of profiles sequentially positioned along that line. Cross-sectional views 30 meters apart, 500 meters in length. And you can use this for a very interesting analysis of the transition of terrain as you move through an area. So standard profiling, very simple cross-sectional view. A little more advanced is our perpendicular profiling tool. So the final thing we're going to talk about here is kind of coming full circle. We started by discussing the ways of getting data into the application, online data, etc. And we're going to finish by getting data out. Obviously, you can export any files. We'll talk about that in just a second, but you can also print maps. It's a very, very powerful printing function. I'm going to simulate that process as well. First of all, to note the export process from the file menu. Export, and then there's various flavors depending on your data. You can export elevation data, such as what we created in our previous workflow. You can export your vectors, you can export your rasters, and variations in that theme as well. You can export to a spatial database, or even export to the cloud. So multiple ways of getting your data out. You can generate a PDF. The PDF you generate would be a geospatial PDF. In other words, it would retain its geographic intelligence, so you can load it up in whatever PDF reader. You can actually see coordinates as you move around on that PDF. That's another great export option. Or, as I mentioned, we can print the map. And let's quickly take a look at an example. Now we've come back to one of the workflows we worked on earlier, which is these zones. We assign some colors, and let's assume that this is what we want to print. There is a layout function, map layout editor, right here in the toolbar. And to make this a little easier, I actually have done most of the work already. I'm just going to pop this open, and you can see I've actually created a layout with the legend. And if I zoom, scroll down a little bit, actually pull this up, you can see I've got a scale bar along the bottom, I've got a little logo, etc. So this is obviously a lot of work's been done already. These elements, as we call them, were inserted just simply by manually placing them. They can be picked up and dragged. I can select my legend, I can move it to a new location. So it's completely editable. And this is a what you see is what you get function. You design it here, you hit print or send it to your plotter, and it will look exactly like it does on the preview mode. Just to show how this process works, I'm going to add one more element. I'm going to insert a text element, and I'm going to make this the title of my map. I'm going to call it Zones. And let's select a font that's a little bit bigger than the default because it's a poster size. I want to bump it up to 72 point. We'll make it bold text, and we'll make it Verdana. And we'll click OK. And I also want to not have the frame around it, so we'll turn that off. And we'll click OK. And you can see it's placed my label right here. I can also make it aligned based on the layout. I can align it either center, left, right, top, bottom, middle. I'm going to make it center. Just shifted it slightly so we know my map title is now centered precisely in the middle of my map layout. I hit print, send it to my plotter, and I have a printed map. So as anticipated, I went a little long with apologies. Hopefully it wasn't too inconvenient for you. But as you can see, there's a lot to cover. Today, my objective was just to introduce you to some of the main features and functions of the software. Obviously, there's a lot more involved in some of those analysis tools that we didn't have a chance to cover. One thing I want to show you before I let you go, I'm just going to minimize Global Mapper and go to the Blue Marble website. If you want more information on Global Mapper, or indeed if you want to download a trial copy, go to the Global Mapper menu. You can read all about the software here, read some more information about some of the tools that we looked at today, and probably most importantly, you can also download a trial version. The trial is a 14-day trial. You'll be prompted when you install to license, and if you don't have a license, you can opt for the trial. Finally, if you have additional questions, under the About Us section in our website, all the way at the bottom where it says Contact Us, you'll see a number of phone numbers in here. You'll see some email addresses, our sales team, our technical support team. Feel free to get in touch if you have any additional questions. Thank you for joining me today, and hopefully this gave you enough information about Global Mapper to maybe entice you to go take a look at it, download it, and see if it works for you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, David. That was a great introduction to Global Mapper. So, as David mentioned, for those of you who have more questions, please feel free to visit our website. I'll also be here now for the live Q&A session after this video to answer any technical questions you may have. I'll be joined by Laura Ramage, one of our senior account managers, for any sales-related questions which may come in. I look forward to speaking with you then.